The city lights shimmered through a thin veil of mist, turning the streets into a sea of hazy neon reflections. The air carried a biting chill, the kind that settled deep in the bones, whispering a silent warning to those who dared to linger in the darkness. Jonathan Pierce, a self-made millionaire, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored coat as he stepped out of an upscale restaurant. He had just finished an extravagant dinner with his wife Eleanor, celebrating their 10th anniversary. The evening had been perfect, or so it seemed. Eleanor's smile was radiant, her laughter effortless, but something about her eyes, something felt off. He shook off the thought and strode toward his sleek black Mercedes, the keys clicking in his palm. That was when he saw him. A boy, no older than 12, filthy and shivering, stood near the curb. His clothes were torn, his face smeared with grime, and his eyes, those hollow, fear-stricken eyes, bore into Jonathan like a blade. "Sir, please don't drive that car," the boy pleaded, his voice barely more than a whisper. Jonathan furrowed his brows. "What? Your wife? She cut the brakes." For a moment, Jonathan didn't speak. The sheer absurdity of the accusation sent a flicker of anger through him. Eleanor? His wife? The woman who had stood beside him through thick and thin? "Listen, kid, I don't know what game you're playing, but I saw her." The boy stepped closer, his fingers twitching at his sides. "She was in your garage, with a knife. She cut something under your car. You can't drive it." Jonathan exhaled sharply. "Who put you up to this? Someone trying to scam me for money?" The boy shook his head violently. "I live on the streets, sir. I see things people aren't supposed to see. You have to believe me." The tension in Jonathan's chest coiled tight. He glanced back at the restaurant, searching for Eleanor. She was still inside, chatting with the valet. He looked at the boy again. His lips trembled, his body shaking from more than just the cold. A normal person would have dismissed it. A mere coincidence. A street kid babbling nonsense. But something about the boy's terror felt too real. "Fine," Jonathan muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. He pulled out his phone, turning on the flashlight. "You said she cut something under the car?" The boy nodded. Jonathan crouched beside the vehicle, heart pounding as he aimed the light underneath. At first, he saw nothing but the standard undercarriage, black metal, pipes, and shadows stretching deep. But then, a glint of something, a severed brake line, a clean cut. Cold dread slithered down his spine. His breath came short and uneven. This had to be some kind of mistake. Eleanor, she wouldn't... Would she? He stood up too fast, dizziness rushing to his head. The boy stared at him, expectant, terrified. "Sir?" Jonathan took a step back from the car, his mind spinning. He had spent years with Eleanor, built a life with her. She had never given him any reason to. But then, hadn't she been acting different lately? A little too perfect? A little too... rehearsed? The restaurant doors swung open. Eleanor emerged, her elegant figure silhouetted against the golden glow of the entrance. She smiled as she approached. "Ready to go, darling?" she asked sweetly, pressing a hand against his chest. Jonathan swallowed, forcing a smile. "Actually, I forgot something inside. Just give me a minute." Her brows knitted together. "What did you forget?" "Just business papers," he lied. Eleanor studied him for a fraction too long. Then, slowly, she nodded. "All right, but don't take too long." Jonathan turned back toward the restaurant, his heartbeat thudding against his ribs. He had to think. He had to understand why. And most of all, he had to get away. But as he walked toward the restaurant, the boy grabbed his sleeve, his grip firm despite his small frame. "You shouldn't go back inside," the boy whispered urgently. "She knows you know." Jonathan froze. And then, for the first time that night, he truly understood. The danger wasn't just in the car. The danger was standing right behind him. Jonathan's throat tightened. The boy's words rang in his ears like a death knell. "She knows you know." The air suddenly felt thick, suffocating. He could feel Eleanor's presence behind him, her gaze pressing against his back like an icy dagger. If she had really tampered with his car, if she had truly intended for him to die tonight, then she wouldn't let him walk away. His mind raced. "Act normal, don't panic, don't let her see the fear." Jonathan forced a chuckle and ruffled the boy's hair in an almost fatherly manner. "All right, kid, that's enough stories for tonight." He turned to Eleanor with a weary smile. "He was just telling me some nonsense about ghosts in the alley." Eleanor's eyes flicked between them, her lips curving into a slow, indulgent smile. "Ghosts, huh? How charming." The boy remained silent, his small hands clenched into fists. His eyes pleaded with Jonathan. "Don't go back inside. Don't turn your back on her." But Jonathan had no choice. He needed to buy time. He gave Eleanor a quick kiss on the cheek, tasting the faint traces of wine and something else, something bitter, metallic. "I'll be right back," he murmured, slipping past her into the restaurant's entrance. The warmth of the interior was a sharp contrast to the cold outside, but it did nothing to ease the chill settling in his bones. His pulse pounded as he stepped into the dimly lit hallway leading to the restroom. He wasn't actually heading to the bathroom. No, he needed a moment to think. He needed to call someone. The police? His lawyer? Anyone. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone. His fingers trembled as he opened his contacts. Who could he trust? A soft shuffle behind him made his blood run cold. Jonathan turned slowly. Eleanor stood in the hallway's entrance, her silhouette barely illuminated by the flickering chandelier. She was blocking the only exit. His stomach knotted. "What are you doing?" he asked, keeping his voice even. Eleanor tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "I was just thinking," she said, stepping forward. "It's strange, don't you think?" Jonathan clenched his phone tighter. "What's strange?" She took another step. Her heels barely made a sound against the carpeted floor. "That boy," she mused. "How did he know about the car?" Jonathan swallowed hard. "I don't know. Maybe he was just guessing?" Eleanor's smile sharpened. "You don't actually believe him, do you?" Jonathan forced a laugh. "Of course not." Eleanor held his gaze for a moment too long. Then, just as suddenly, she sighed and shook her head. "You've been working too hard, love. You look pale." She reached out to touch his face. Jonathan flinched. Eleanor's hand froze mid-air. Her smile never wavered, but her eyes darkened. "You flinched," she whispered. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Eleanor took another step closer. Jonathan instinctively stepped back, only to realize he had nowhere left to go. The hallway was a dead end. She exhaled softly, shaking her head. "Oh, Jonathan, you weren't supposed to find out this way." His blood turned to ice. She knew. She knew that he knew. Jonathan's mind screamed for him to move, to shove past her, to run. But before he could act, Eleanor's voice turned low, almost gentle. "I didn't want this to be messy." Jonathan's breath hitched. His hand hovered over his phone, but he knew she would stop him before he could make a call. She took another step forward. Then, the lights in the hallway flickered violently. A shadow moved behind Eleanor. Jonathan barely had time to process what he was seeing before a hand shot out from the darkness and grabbed Eleanor by the shoulder. She let out a sharp gasp, spinning around, only to find nothing there. Nothing but the emptiness of the hallway. Jonathan's pulse pounded. He hadn't imagined it. Something had been there. Eleanor turned back to him, her smile gone, her expression unreadable. Jonathan saw it then, a flicker of fear in her eyes. She wasn't alone in this game anymore. Something else was watching. And for the first time tonight, Eleanor was the one who looked uncertain. Jonathan didn't wait for her next move. The moment she glanced over her shoulder, he bolted. He shoved past her, sprinting through the restaurant like a man running for his life. Because he was. The boy was still outside, waiting, his face twisted with worry. "Did she?" "No time," Jonathan gasped, grabbing the boy's wrist. "We need to go." The boy nodded and took off, running alongside him. Jonathan didn't stop until they reached the end of the street, his breath ragged, his mind still racing. He turned back once, just once, toward the restaurant. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching him, not chasing, not screaming, just watching. And in the dim glow of the streetlight, Jonathan saw something that sent his stomach twisting into knots. She was smiling, as if she already knew that no matter where he ran, she would find him. The night swallowed Jonathan and the boy as they ran, their breath ragged, their shadows stretching long under the flickering streetlights. Jonathan had no idea where he was going. He just knew he had to get as far away from Eleanor as possible. The city, usually so familiar, felt like an endless labyrinth. Every corner, every alley, every dimly lit road pulsed with unseen threats. His mind couldn't stop replaying the moment in the restaurant hallway. Eleanor's eyes flickering with something not quite human, and that shadow behind her. Jonathan didn't believe in ghosts, at least not until tonight. The boy pulled at his sleeve. "We have to go somewhere safe." Jonathan forced himself to slow down, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. "Who are you?" he rasped. "How did you know?" The boy hesitated, then cast a glance over his shoulder. His eyes darted through the darkened streets, scanning for something unseen. "I'll explain," he said, "but not here." Jonathan nodded, and they ducked into a side alley, pressing themselves into the shadows. The distant hum of the city buzzed around them, but Jonathan wasn't listening. His ears were tuned for footsteps, hers. For a few seconds, there was nothing. No one was following them. Yet, the boy exhaled. "I've been watching your wife for a while." Jonathan's blood ran cold. "Excuse me? I live near your neighborhood, in the abandoned house across from yours. I see things, hear things." The boy's voice was hollow, distant. "And your wife?" "She's not who you think she is." Jonathan didn't know whether to be furious or terrified. His gut screamed at him to deny it, to call the boy crazy, but he had seen it himself. The brake line. The way Eleanor's expression shifted when she knew he had figured it out. The thing behind her. Jonathan swallowed hard. "Why? Why would she want to kill me?" The boy's gaze darkened. "Because you're in the way." Jonathan frowned. "Of what?" The boy's lips parted, but before he could speak, a noise. A slow, deliberate tapping sound echoed through the alley. Jonathan's stomach twisted. Click, click, click. High heels. Jonathan knew that sound too well. Eleanor's heels. The same ones she had worn to dinner. She was here. The boy grabbed Jonathan's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Run!" Jonathan didn't hesitate. They bolted through the alley, weaving between piles of trash and rusted dumpsters. The clicking behind them never sped up. Eleanor wasn't running. She was simply walking, calm, confident. She knew he was afraid, and she was enjoying it. Jonathan's lungs burned as they turned a corner and stumbled onto a deserted street. The boy pointed toward an old, abandoned warehouse. "There, we can hide." Jonathan nodded, too breathless to argue. They burst through the broken door, the smell of rust and decay slamming into them. The warehouse was massive, tall metal shelves stacked with forgotten crates, broken glass crunching beneath their feet. Jonathan collapsed against a pillar, gasping for breath. The boy peered out through a shattered window. Silence. Jonathan's chest rose and fell rapidly. "Did we lose her?" The boy didn't answer immediately. Then, finally, "No." Jonathan stiffened. What do you mean, no? The boy turned to him, his expression grim. You don't lose her, she always finds you. Jonathan felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. His hands shook. His entire life, his perfect, curated life, was unraveling before his eyes. His wife wasn't just a murderer. She was something else, something inhuman. The boy sat down on an overturned crate, his small body barely visible in the shadows. Your wife isn't just after you. Jonathan's mouth felt dry. Then who? The boy's eyes flickered upward. Jonathan followed his gaze and froze. A figure stood on the warehouse's second-floor balcony, a woman, dressed in a sleek, dark gown, Eleanor. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. She hadn't made a sound, hadn't kicked the door open, hadn't climbed up the stairs. She was just there. She smiled, slowly. Jonathan, she cooed, her voice dripping with amusement. Are we really playing this game? Jonathan grabbed the boy's arm. They needed to move. Now Eleanor tilted her head. Do you know what happens when you try to run from me, darling? Jonathan's heart slammed against his ribs. Eleanor raised a single delicate hand, and every light in the warehouse exploded. The room plunged into darkness. Jonathan's ears rang from the sound of shattering bulbs. He felt the boy's hand tighten around his own. We have to get out of here, the boy whispered. Jonathan tried to steady his breathing. Where? Then, a sound. Not footsteps, breathing. Close. Jonathan could barely see through the darkness, but he felt her. Somewhere in the shadows, Eleanor was here with them, and she was waiting. A whisper slithered through the air. Nowhere to run, darling? The boy yanked Jonathan's arm, dragging him toward the warehouse exit. Go! They sprinted toward the door, shoving past debris, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Jonathan risked one last glance over his shoulder. For a second, just a second, he thought he saw her shape shift, a flickering, grotesque distortion of something no longer human. The warehouse door burst open as they stumbled onto the street. The cold night air hit Jonathan's face like a slap. They kept running, and running, and running, until the city swallowed them whole, until the lights of the warehouse disappeared behind them, and until Eleanor's voice finally stopped whispering in his ears. But Jonathan knew one thing. This wasn't over. Eleanor had let them go, on purpose, because the hunt had just begun. The city blurred past them in streaks of neon and shadow. Jonathan's legs burned, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't dare stop. The boy clung to his wrist, guiding him through back streets and alleys Jonathan had never noticed before. They ran until the sounds of the city dimmed, until they were swallowed by the kind of darkness where streetlights didn't reach. Finally, they stopped. Jonathan leaned against a damp brick wall, struggling to catch his breath. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs like a frantic prisoner trying to escape. The boy, barely winded, scanned the street cautiously. She'll find us again, he muttered. She always does. Jonathan's stomach twisted. What is she? The boy's expression darkened. You already know. Jonathan shook his head violently. She's just... His voice cracked. She's just my wife. The boy's silence told him everything. Jonathan pressed a hand against his forehead. This is insane, he whispered. I've known Eleanor for 10 years. We built a life together. She's not... He couldn't even say the word. The boy crouched down, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. Have you ever noticed things? Things that don't make sense? Jonathan hesitated. Flashes of memory surfaced, ones he had always dismissed. The way Eleanor never seemed to age, the way she always knew things before he told her, the way shadows moved strangely around her when she thought no one was looking, the way she never got sick, never bled, the way she had smiled tonight, as if she already knew how this would end. Jonathan swallowed hard. She's not human, is she? he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy's eyes flickered with something close to pity. No, he said. She's not. Jonathan's breath came short and uneven. Then what is she? The boy exhaled, his gaze distant. Something old. Jonathan frowned. Old? The boy nodded. Older than this city. Older than most things that walk the earth. She's not the only one. Jonathan felt his skin crawl. There are more? The boy didn't answer. Instead, he stood and gestured toward the street. Come on, we can't stay here. Jonathan hesitated. Where are we going? The boy met his gaze. To someone who can help. The last hope. Jonathan had no reason to trust the boy, but he had even less reason to go back home. So he followed. They weaved through silent streets, through crumbling alleyways littered with forgotten things. Eventually, they reached an old brownstone, its windows dark, its front door covered in deep scratches, as if something had tried and failed to claw its way inside. The boy knocked. Jonathan shifted uneasily. Who lives here? Someone who knows how to stop her, the boy whispered. The door creaked open an inch, and a single eye peered through the gap. A woman's voice rasped, "Not now, boy." She found him, the boy whispered urgently. She's hunting. The door opened wider. Jonathan barely had time to process the woman before she pulled them both inside. The room was cluttered, filled with strange objects, dried herbs, rusted chains, melted candles that oozed black wax. The walls were covered in symbols Jonathan didn't recognize. The woman was old, but not fragile. Her gray hair was tied back, her face lined with years of knowledge Jonathan didn't understand. She locked the door behind them and slid 3 bolts into place. Then, she turned to Jonathan. "You should be dead," she said simply. Jonathan stiffened. "Excuse me?" She ignored him and turned to the boy. "Why did she let him go?" The boy hesitated. "I don't know." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's bad." Jonathan's patience snapped. "Would someone please tell me what the hell is going on?" The woman sighed and motioned toward an old wooden chair. "Sit." Jonathan sat. The woman took a deep breath. "Your wife," she said, "isn't human." Jonathan swallowed hard. He had already accepted this, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. The woman continued. "She's something older, something that wears the skin of a person, something that walks among us, unnoticed." Jonathan's head spun. "Why did she marry me?" The woman studied him for a long time before she spoke again. "She needed an anchor." Jonathan frowned. "An anchor?" The woman nodded. "These things, they aren't meant to live in this world for long. They need something to tie them here, something permanent, a human connection." Jonathan's blood ran cold. "She married you to stay in this world," the woman said, "to blend in, to make sure no one suspected what she really is." Jonathan felt sick. His entire marriage, his entire life, had been nothing but a carefully constructed lie. He clenched his fists. "Then why kill me now?" The woman hesitated. "Because she doesn't need you anymore." Jonathan's breath hitched. "She's been here too long," the woman murmured. "Something changed. Maybe she's stronger now. Maybe she found a new anchor." Jonathan felt a deep, gnawing dread settle in his chest. What happens if she doesn't have an anchor? The woman's expression darkened. "She disappears," she whispered. "Or worse, she becomes something else." Jonathan's hands trembled. He had spent years with Eleanor, slept beside her, laughed with her, loved her, and none of it had been real. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman stood and grabbed a rusted knife from the table. "You sever the bond." Jonathan hesitated. "How?" The woman's gaze was cold and unyielding. "You kill her." Jonathan's stomach twisted. Before he could respond, Something slammed against the door. Bang! The bolts rattled. Jonathan's blood turned to ice. She had found them. A soft, familiar voice slithered through the cracks in the wood. "Jonathan." The boy grabbed Jonathan's arm, his grip painfully tight. "Don't listen to her," he whispered. Another bang. The door shuddered. The woman grabbed a piece of chalk and began drawing symbols on the floor, her movements quick and desperate. Jonathan stood frozen, heart pounding. He knew that voice. The same voice that had whispered to him in the dark for 10 years. The same voice that had once told him she loved him. And now, it was outside the door, calling his name. "Jonathan," Eleanor's voice purred. "I found you." The bolts began to unlock on their own. Jonathan took a step back. The woman's voice turned sharp. "Get ready." Jonathan barely had time to register what was happening before the final bolt snapped free, and the door swung open. Darkness flooded the room, and Eleanor stepped inside. The door creaked open, spilling unnatural darkness into the room. The candles flickered wildly, their flames twisting and shrinking as if recoiling from something unseen. And there, in the doorway, stood Eleanor. But it wasn't the Eleanor Jonathan had married. Her form flickered like a broken signal, shifting between something almost human and something wrong. Her eyes weren't just black, they were empty, as if they led to an abyss that had no end. She stepped forward, barefoot now, the sharp clack of her high heels gone. Her dress no longer sleek and elegant, but tattered, as though she had walked through a storm of thorns. Shadows slithered behind her, twisting unnaturally in the dim candlelight. She tilted her head, her lips curling into a slow, knowing smile. "Jonathan," she purred, "come here." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. His entire body screamed at him to move, to run, but his legs refused to obey. The old woman shoved a rusted knife into his hands. "Don't let her speak," she hissed. "She'll weave her way into your mind. Cut the bond, now." Jonathan's hands trembled. His grip tightened around the blade, but could he do this? Could he really kill the woman he had spent 10 years loving, even if she wasn't really a woman at all? Eleanor took another step inside, her bare feet not making a single sound. "I know you're scared," she whispered, her voice velvet smooth. "But I love you, Jonathan. I always have." Jonathan's stomach churned. He clenched his jaw. "Then why try to kill me?" Eleanor smiled, too wide. "Because you're the last thing holding me here." The boy tugged at Jonathan's arm. "She's lying." Eleanor's gaze snapped to the child, and for the first time her smile faltered. "You," she said, her voice losing its human warmth. Jonathan felt the boy stiffen. Eleanor's expression darkened. "You should have stayed out of this." Jonathan barely had time to react before the walls began to rot. The air filled with the stench of decay. The wooden floor beneath them groaned as if something huge was shifting underneath. And then, hands, pale, withered hands, erupted from the walls, clawing, reaching. Some were human, some weren't. The old woman began chanting, her voice urgent and fierce, drawing symbols in the air with trembling fingers. The symbols glowed, flickering like dying embers. Eleanor's head twitched sharply, her smile returning, though now strained. "Jonathan," she crooned, taking another step forward. Jonathan stumbled back. She reached out, her long, delicate fingers stretching toward his face. And in that moment, Jonathan saw everything. Flashes of memories that weren't his. Eleanor, walking through the centuries. Different faces, different lives, but always the same hunger. She had worn many names, played many roles, a wife, a friend, a mother, a daughter, and every time she found an anchor, a human who trusted her, and when she no longer needed them, she took them apart, piece by piece. Jonathan's breath hitched. His entire life had been a lie. He looked down at the rusted blade in his hands. Eleanor smiled. "You don't want to hurt me?" she whispered. For a second, Jonathan hesitated. Then the boy shoved him forward. "Do it!" Jonathan didn't think. He lunged. The blade plunged deep into Eleanor's stomach. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a sound erupted from Eleanor's throat. A scream, but not one of pain. A laugh. Jonathan's heart stopped. Eleanor looked down at the knife buried in her flesh. Then, slowly, she lifted her gaze to meet his. Her voice was nothing but a breath of shadow. "You should have gone for the heart." And then, she moved, faster than anything human. Jonathan barely had time to react before she was on him, her hands wrapping around his throat. Her touch burned like ice, her fingers digging into his skin with impossible strength. The boy screamed. The old woman threw a fistful of powder into the air, her chant rising into a frenzied shriek. The symbols on the walls ignited, their light searing into Eleanor's skin. She screeched, her form flickering violently, coming apart at the seams. Jonathan gasped for breath as her grip loosened. The boy grabbed the rusted knife from Eleanor's stomach and plunged it into her heart. Eleanor's eyes widened. For the first time, she looked afraid. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no sound came out. Her body convulsed, once, twice, then collapsed. For a long moment, the room was utterly still. Then Eleanor's body began to crumble, her flesh turning to ash, her bones splintering into dust. The unnatural darkness faded. The clawing hands retreated into the walls. And just like that, she was gone. The aftermath. Jonathan sat in stunned silence, staring at the pile of ashes where his wife had once stood. His hands still trembled. His throat ached from her grip. The old woman exhaled shakily, wiping sweat from her brow. "It's over," she murmured. The boy, breathing hard, knelt beside the ashes. He scooped up a small handful, letting them slip through his fingers. His face held no joy, only quiet relief. Jonathan swallowed hard. "What happens now?" The old woman studied him. "She won't come back," she said. "But others like her." Jonathan didn't need her to finish the sentence. He closed his eyes. He had spent years in a perfect marriage, never realizing he was living with something inhuman. And now he was free. But at what cost? Jonathan stood, his legs unsteady. He turned to the boy. "Who are you?" The boy hesitated. Then, with a small, tired smile, he said, "Someone who lost to her once." Jonathan nodded. He didn't need to ask more. He took one last look at the ashes on the floor. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with his life. She had never been real. He exhaled slowly. Then, without another word, he walked out into the night. And for the first time in 10 years, he felt truly alone. The end.